Welcome to Think Tank. Dr. Romanovska, what are the core legal risks tied to seizing Russian sovereign assets held in Europe?
Yes, first of all, we have to take into account the sovereign immunity and international asset confiscation. It's quite vague. Why sovereign immunity refers to principle that a state is protected from being sued in a foreign court or having assets seized without its consent. The principle is enshrined with both customary international law and various multinational and multilateral treaties, including United Nations Convention of Jurisdictional Immunities of States and Their Property from 2004. The EU potential role to confiscate frozen Russian assets may be really legally complex in this context, as such actions could violate sovereign immunity. If we take into account the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Relations from 1961, we will see that there is a very strong protection of diplomatic and consular property and funds of foreign states, which is reinforced the nation that the foreign governments assets should generally be immune from seizure. On the other hand, the UN Convention of Jurisdictional Immunities of the State, it's a treaty which has already established the framework of sovereign immunity, which allows for certain exceptions. In this extent, for instance, involving commercial transaction or in cases related to human rights violation. However, the treaty has not been that widely ratified, particularly by countries like US. And thus this application might be really debated in this particular state. We have to take into account as well that the key exception which can apply in a Russian asset are the commercial exceptions. Because under the international law, sovereign immunity does not apply when the state engages in commercial activities. And if frozen Russian assets are connected in any way to this commercial activities, they might be a subject of seizure by EU. The exception might be particularly relevant in the case of assets held by Russian government in foreign financial institutions or commercial enterprises abroad. That's the reason why this is the narrow but the path to move. Additionally, violation of international law could as well provide the grounds of suspension of sovereign immunity. In this context, EU actions may be justified under the principle of international law if the confiscation of the redirection of assets is framed as response to Russian violation of international humanitarian law or its role in ongoing work against Ukraine. Moreover, International Court of Justice, ICJ, could as well become a venue of adjudicating the issue. The ICJ role would likely focus on whether EU actions against Russia violate its rights under the sovereign immunity principle or not necessarily. This will actually allow to give a response of violation or not of international treaties or a war crime. Another thing is legal precedents and the global sanctions, because US and Western precedents actually show that, for instance, US has imposed sanctions under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, FSAI, which allows a seizure of assets in the case of state-sponsored terrorism or violation of international law. And through EU legal system, we can see that maybe there are not such aggressive application, but there are as well quite similar measures. For instance, United States, in the context of the United States versus metric tons of oil in 1981, UN legal case where the seizure of asset, in this case oil, or Kuwait Airways Corporation versus Iraq in 1994, there was US Court of Appeal which actually stated that the invasion of Kuwait was the reason why the sovereign immunity does not apply when states commit violation of international law. In this case, it was aggression and war crimes, of course. When European Court of Justice will come into the theater as well as a let's say judicial force and as a wise man, prudent, as we say in French, this might be really important way to assess is the confiscation of assets were contested in the EU legal framework or not.
Yes.
Because we have to take into account that European Court of Justice, in different than British or American way of law being stated, has as well right to actually make a quite, let's say, final assessment of the law. And if we take into account the decision of sovereign assets will have to be closely, of course, aligned with EU sanctions regime. So we will have here, let's say, a watchdog as well, who will play a role of ensuring that this quite narrow path between what is permissible and
Yes.
what is an interpretation could be
Well,
taken. And I
Mr.
think that actually European
yes. Well,
Court of
Mr.
Justice would
Swenson,
do it.
Mr. Swenson, how does Trump's suspension of aid reshape European Union's strategic and financial calculations regarding Ukraine?
I think it's been a wake-up call for the Europeans. I mean, this is not new. President Trump's been talking about the lack of seriousness from Europe for the last 8 years, and so that there's been some very minor improvements in military spending and defense and security spending, but really just at the margins. The largest economies haven't really moved the needle. You might see some changes from Germany with with agreeing to move defense and security outside of the debt brake. So you might see some movement, but generally speaking, I think the President Trump's most recent actions are just another wake-up call to the Europeans. The U.S. has been providing security for generations, for 80 years, and at a great expense to the American taxpayer. And I do think that the Europeans have benefited from that, obviously benefited greatly. And also keep in mind, you have a $180 billion trade deficit between the EU and the US. So there's some real financial implications here. That's not to suggest that seizing $300 billion in Russian assets is the right move because they feel like they have to, find some resources somewhere. I think they would be better to change their policies on defense and security spending, liberate their economies by deregulating and even liberating the energy sector in those countries to stop the dependence on imports, specifically Russian imports. So there's a lot of work to do in Europe. I don't think it's only about support for Ukraine. I think it's a much bigger picture. The Europeans bought $22 billion worth of Russian oil, gas, and coal last year. This isn't pre-invasion numbers, from 2021. This isn't even pre-Crimea invasion numbers from a decade ago. So, there's a lot of work to do in Europe, and I think this might be the beginning of fixing those problems, but I've yet to see that.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Romanovska, do you agree that maybe seizing Russian assets would not be the way to allocate some European Union finances to Ukraine? Or do you think that it is one way of and a proper way of doing it? You've mentioned how applicable the seizure could be, but when would the seizure violate international law, and can workarounds be justified?
Well, the thing is that we have to take into account that in The Hague, there is a quite prominent UN body, International Court of Justice, but as well very prominent court as well, which is International Criminal Court. And the EU, as a signatory of the Rome Statute, has a vested interest of ensuring that Russian officials, for instance, who have committed war crimes are held accountable. But the confiscation of redirection of frozen Russian assets could be framed as an effort, for instance, to support repatriation for victims of a war crime. We have to take into account that, for instance, as far as I'm concerned, that the context of global war crimes and humanitarian law violations, committed during the conflict in Ukraine, it's already a subject of the work of the court. However, for instance, United States are not the signatory of the Rome Statute, so they will be really difficult to ensure it. And if asset seizure will be redirected, for instance, for war reparations, under the international law, the EU could argue that the confiscation of frozen assets is a part of broader effort to fund reparation to the victims of Russian war crimes. This tragedy would align theoretically with international law, as it could be seen as legitimate use of frozen assets to assist the victim of unlawful aggression. In the ICC proceedings, for instance, if this court will pursue cases against Russian leadership of the war crimes, as it already started with, let's say, Israel, the EU could potentially help fund the process by using a portion of these frozen assets. However, I would rather see it as an impact of the global legal and geopolitical order, because the US, who traditionally, as my predecessor said, has been a leader of sanction and asset freezes, particularly in cases involving sovereign immunity and international law violation, EU will actually move out of its comfort zone. The Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, have deeply financial interests both in the EU and the US markets, and they could view this EU action as destabilizing for global finance. The legal chaos, which might result for this unilateral EU action, might lead to as well, for instance, the Gulf states to reconsider the investment in the EU and favoring more stable, predictable financial system like US dollar or China yuan. But we have to see it as well, but the EU, what is trying to do is as well, in certain contexts, trying to step in as a global leader in promoting the rule of law, humanitarian justice, and peace-building effort. Let's not forget that international finance governance and humanitarian protection in the context of, for instance, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are quite aligned. And this could potentially as well strengthen its strategic partnership with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which might be in the absence of this, let's say now, consistent US leadership, as United States President Mr. Trump is more focused on America first. Let's not forget about the very important thing as well, that with US aid being halted by Trump, we are facing as well a global lack of financing. And potentially this money can be used for actually supporting those global actions which are connected to the peace.
Well, then Mr. Swenson, beg your pardon, Mr. Swenson, now do you believe then that the US shift under Trump and the America First policy leaves Europe with no choice but to act independently, or is there still hope for cooperation?
Well, there'll be plenty of cooperation. And I think that's what President Trump is aiming for is, America first is not America alone. It's American leadership, but we need support from our biggest allies. And the Europeans have really been falling down for generations on that. So hopefully there'll be more support. There's an obvious pivot to Asia, and that's one of the reasons that it's important for the Europeans to step up in terms of defense and security. For many reasons, but that's one of them is the U.S. must pivot to Asia. 15 years ago, during the Obama administration, he made a deliberate call to reduce the capability of American forces to fight wars on two fronts. He lowered that to 1.5, and then, of course, in the Biden years, it was lowered to 1. So the U.S. capability, like it or not, is only to fight a one-front war. And that means the Europeans really have to step up regarding their own defense. So we have a lot of challenges here. The fact that the U.S. will pivot to Asia will be for a great benefit for the world and for Europe, for that matter, for the West in general. So, the reality is, the G7 ex-U.S. has gone from 70% of global GDP down to 40%. The U.S. has stayed at 25% of GDP, like they have been since the 1800s. But that doesn't mean that they have unlimited resources. I think it's worth mentioning we have $36 trillion in debt in the United States. 11 trillion of that debt came in the last 4 years. So and that's doubled in the last 10 years from 18 to 36. So the reckless spending in the United States is not something that we brag about or that you hear much about, but it's really created a burden on U.S. taxpayers right now. So they just can't continue to fund the defense of Europe without European support.
Dr. Romanovska, now, how dangerous is the president this move could set for trust in Eurozone institutions in general?
Well, actually, first of all, I have to agree with my predecessor. That's really true. The thing is that this actually, in the context of the EU, can lead to something beneficial if we look from the brighter and more optimistic part of this coin. The thing is that Europe stopped looking at the security and internal security of the EU as something which is absolutely unchangeable, and is something which for a very long time has been, let's say, left aside when it comes to the investment and when it comes to the proper funding. This actually can lead to the situation when not only the EU will be strengthened as well due to the investment in this kind of dual defense, dual use technologies, but as well it will strengthen cooperation between NATO states, but as well between NATO states and the EU. So actually, not chaos, not I don't want to say crisis, but this difficult situation may lead to something really positive, because we could see that for quite some time, even though it was not directly observed in mass media and the mainstream media as well, European Union changed its policy when it comes to the migration, when it comes to the funding, and when it comes to the expectation. They stopped giving money just as a, let's say, as a charity, but they started to as well expect something in return, which is actually really good because it gives a spark of the investment, entrepreneurship, etc. in the more poorer countries. The thing is that now, if the EU will continue its work, in certain parts will replace the funding which has been halted by USAID and the United States, it can lead to the situation when the EU will be funding various research and various investment within the neighborhood countries, but it as well will strengthen its economical independence as well as sovereignty and independence in the context of the economy and its own manufacturing area in the market, in the EU single market, which will be strengthened as well. I would really be very difficult to go on trade war and tariff war with US, because this is our ally from the centuries. And I think that after some time, with all those bad emotions, which unfortunately we are harvesting now after the difficult period of the election within the EU and within the US, I really hope that this actually will be a new spark to actually start in a good fund to go further.
Well,
so,
Mr. Swenson, Mr. Swenson, could the asset seizure by the European Union cause global economic players like China or Gulf states to divest from Europe?
Yeah, that's a great risk. And if you look at what we've seen in the last few years, when some of these countries were pulling away, trying to form their own currency, like the BRIC currency, for example. You had the Saudis, Indians, Russians, Chinese. This is a great risk. But we of course want to keep the dollar as the global go-to currency, and with the euro right behind it. And I think there would be a risk there. There's also a great risk of pushing the Russians toward China, elevating that partnership, or that strategic partnership. That's one of President Trump's very deliberate aims, is to make sure that we collectively are not pushing Russia into a more dedicated partnership with China. We'd like to really keep those two countries from aligning to any great degree. This is much like reaching out to China in the early 70s when Nixon and Kissinger went there, as well as Nixon and détente with the Soviet Union. There's always merit to keeping your friends close and your enemies closer.
Mm-hmm.